Today we're jumping right into one of the most critical and honestly most complicated chapters in American history, the Civil War. We're going to look at the mind-blowing technology that changed how wars are fought forever, and then we're going to get into the battle over what the war even meant, a fight that's still going on right now.
You know, I think historian Shelby Foote just nailed it with this quote. The Civil War wasn't just a bunch of battles. It was the moment the United States had to decide what it was going to be. It was a crisis of identity, and everything was on the line.
And just look at this. This was a conflict like nothing the country had ever seen. The sheer scale of it, the new kinds of weapons, the absolute brutality. It was like a glimpse into the future of modern warfare, and believe me, the nation was not ready for it.
So here's our plan. First, we'll talk about what made this a new kind of war. Then, we'll dive into the specific technology that made it so deadly. After that, we'll see how people at home saw the war for the first time. Then, we'll get into the messy fight for Reconstruction, and finally, we'll talk about the war over the story itself.
Okay, let's get right into it. A new kind of war. You really have to understand, this conflict was this violent, shocking collision between the past and the future. It's where old-school tactics ran headfirst into the brutal efficiency of the industrial age. So at the start of the war, you've got these generals who are still thinking like it's the 1700s. They're marching their men in these tight, neat lines across open fields. But the problem is, the weapons they were walking towards weren't old, inaccurate muskets. And that mismatch, well, it was a recipe for absolute catastrophe.
And that leads us perfectly into our next point, just how much technology completely changed the game. A few key innovations didn't just alter this war, they changed the very nature of warfare itself, forever.
Okay, now this right here is a massive leap. The standard rifle went from a smoothbore musket, which was maybe accurate to about 50 yards, to the rifled musket. With a new kind of bullet, a soldier could now hit a target from 500 yards away. That's a tenfold increase. All of a sudden, the battlefield was 10 times deadlier.
And if you want to see what that new technology meant in human terms, this is it. At the Battle of Franklin, a Confederate general ordered a frontal charge, just like in the old days, but his men were mowed down by Union rifles before they even got close. Over 1,700 men died in 5 hours. It was a horrifying, bloody lesson in modern firepower. This revolution wasn't just on land, oh no. In 1862, these two iron-plated ships, the Monitor and the Virginia, just pounded on each other for hours, and their cannonballs just bounced off. Can you imagine that? In a single afternoon, every wooden navy in the entire world became instantly obsolete. The war was also changed by information. The telegraph was like the 19th century internet. It gave President Lincoln a direct line to his generals. He could get real-time updates and give orders. The industrial North could build out this network in a way the South just couldn't, sending 1 million messages and gaining a huge strategic advantage. So the technology for killing was evolving fast, but so was the technology for seeing. A photographer named Matthew Brady and his team were about to completely change how everyday people understood the true cost of war.
Before this, your idea of war probably came from a painting, right? All heroic and clean. Brady changed all that. He built these mobile darkrooms and wagons and followed the armies around. He didn't show heroes on horseback. He showed the mud, the camps, and the brutal aftermath of battle.
This account is just horrifying, but it captures the feeling that people got from Brady's work. When he put up his photo exhibit, The Dead of Antietam in New York, people were stunned into silence. They weren't looking at actors or paintings, they were looking at dead American boys. That romantic bubble around war, it burst. But here's a crucial little detail about these photos. You'll never see one of actual combat. The camera technology was just too slow. The exposure time was so long that any movement would just be a blur. So that means every single Civil War photograph we have is from the moments just before the fighting, or, tragically, just after.
All right, so the guns fall silent at Appomattox. The war is over. But in so many ways, the real fight was just getting started. Now came the impossible task of putting a shattered country back together and figuring out what freedom really meant for millions of people.
And wow, this period was just pure chaos. You have the incredible promise of emancipation, but then, boom, Lincoln is killed. His successor, Andrew Johnson, immediately starts clashing with Congress. It's just a bitter, turbulent political fight over the soul of the country. And this is the man in the middle of it all, Andrew Johnson.
He was a Southerner, a former slave owner himself, and his whole plan for Reconstruction was to be incredibly lenient on the former Confederacy. So, of course, he ends up on a direct collision course with a Congress that wants to guarantee rights for newly freed Black Americans.
The great abolitionist leader Frederick Douglass saw exactly what was happening. And this quote just cuts right to the bone. It perfectly sums up the profound sense of betrayal. Imagine you fought and bled for the Union, and now the man in charge seems determined to hand power right back to the people who enslaved you.
And this is what that betrayal looked like in the real world. With Johnson giving them the nod, Southern states passed what were called Black Codes. These were laws designed to control every aspect of Black people's lives, where they could work, if they could own property, even if they could travel. It was slavery by another name, plain and simple.
And that all leads us to our final section. The war on the battlefield was over, but a new war was just beginning. A war for the story, for the memory of the conflict itself, and it's a war that is still being fought today.
At the absolute center of this fight is an idea called the lost cause. It was a very deliberate, very organized effort to rewrite the history of the war. The goal was to reframe the Confederate cause, not as a fight to preserve slavery, but as a noble, heroic struggle for states' rights.
These are the basic points of the myth, that the South wasn't really beaten, just outmanned, that Confederate soldiers were all chivalrous heroes, that enslaved people were actually happy and loyal to their masters, and the big one, that the war had nothing to do with slavery. And for decades, this version of history was pushed into textbooks and carved onto monuments, shaping how generations of Americans understood the war.
But while that romantic story was being told, this was the brutal reality on the ground. The Equal Justice Initiative has documented more than 2,000 racial terror lynchings during Reconstruction. This was the violent truth that the lost cause myth was designed to hide.
Which brings us right back to here, to today. The shooting stopped in 1865, but the battle over what it all meant, the battle over freedom, equality, and the very definition of the United States, has that ever really ended? That's the question we're left with.